this presentation is about, as Brianna said, about being trans at work. And now given our group, this can have a few aspects to it for people who have experienced a transition at work. What people have gone through and similarities there for people who expect to, what they might encounter, and for anyone else who has some interest in there. So I'm trying to keep it open, even though that this will be based primarily on what I went through. It's meant to be more open than just that. The topics that I'll cover for this are background of my experience within here, when to come out. That's kind of a big question probably a lot of people have. How to start the process of doing so. Timelines of planning, because once you go there, it doesn't just happen automatically. How to communicate this to other people, whether that's by you or through other people within the company or the organization you're in. The actions that you may expect. The big day itself of actually coming in for the first time. And then things that do change over time, essentially the aftermath of that. In fact, in case that's for us, I'm just going to pause this and wait for them so they can see what the introduction is. So it's about being trans at work. Okay. So my background is focused primarily on my experiences, but we'll cover some of these things that are here. I used to be a chemical engineer. I used to work in a factory. The degree that I got was in chemical engineering, so I started off in working in the factory. I didn't look quite like this, but kind of like this. Eventually I moved into IT, moved to Minneapolis. I work at Land O'Lakes now as a business analyst, and I've been there for 13 years. And because of my manufacturing background, I do work a lot with manufacturing. And that was something that did come into play, because we figured that people would be fairly okay with this, especially in corporate headquarters, but we thought for people who were in locations, especially because a lot of our locations are more rural type communities, that those are the places where we may find more trouble. So that was just one of our considerations. Also meant that there are a lot of people who know me within the company. So when to come out? My answer is, who knows? There's really no good way of knowing when you should come out of work. I mean, there's some things that can go into consideration. So do you feel like you're ready? Physically, do you feel like you're ready mentally? Do people already know? I mean, some people that I knew decided to transition at work because half the people at work already knew about it from Facebook and other places like that. For me, really, almost no one at work knew, so then I didn't have that as a guide as to when I could or should do it. One of the considerations here that I've got listed is keeping up a dual life. If you think of yourself as presenting part-time, except at work, which is essentially where I was, that having to keep that up, that was actually a lot more difficult than I thought it would be. When some of the essentially have almost two identities. I never thought that that's really what it was, but trying to keep those two things separated. And some of you heard the story about the time that I went to Taco Bell, and I tried to pay, and I paid for something, and they asked me what the name on the order should be, and I couldn't remember who I went out as, and had to think about it for a couple of seconds, and finally couldn't remember who I went out as, and I had to look at the credit card to see what the name was in order to say it. I thought, okay, this is different. This is more difficult than I really thought it was. That was one of my clues that it's time to do it there too. You're never going to be really prepared. And this is my first day, which I look terribly awkward there because I felt really awkward on that first day, and that's unavoidable. You can prepare for as long as you want, and a year after you're going to look back and think, okay, I wasn't really quite ready yet. But I don't think anyone really is ready. And this is something that we've probably all experienced in various ways in different phases of this, but it's hard to take some of those steps. And sometimes it takes leaps of faith. And you'll never really know for sure when the right time is. And there really isn't a right time. As far as starting the process, what I'd read mostly for people is that you should start with HR when you're going to go tell somebody. And I think that actually a better step before that is to step back and find out what you can about the company's or the organization's discrimination policy. If they have a non-discrimination policy that covers things like gender and gender identity, it's good to know that ahead of time in case problems come up that you're ready to address them at the time. Also things like insurance, bathroom policy if there is one. To know those things ahead of time is good. Now, if the company or the organization doesn't have those things well defined, it's good to look at what other organizations have done as equivalent. So you can say, well, we don't have anything written down for this, but here's what other companies have done, especially the ones you can find that are more favorable to you. I do have here, the next one is to talk with HR. And so in this case, I did. We have our own representative in HR for IT within Land O'Lakes, and I set up a meeting with her. And I think I just labeled it as employee information. And I talked with her first. And one of the reasons that they do that is because if your manager is somebody who is not going to be particularly receptive to it, then HR is there to help try to navigate through your management if they're not going to be as supportive as other people would be. In my case, I knew that my manager was going to be okay with things, but I thought I would bring them in first in case that they had some type of procedure, something that they wanted to follow. Now, they didn't because I was the first one to come out, and so that was not defined to that level then. And after I told her and we talked about it, I said, if you don't mind, I'll just tell my manager this afternoon because I have a meeting with them. And I did. And this probably wouldn't happen in the first one because your HR person will probably be surprised and have no idea what to do. But you'll start the process for deciding how you're going to go about the next steps, because there are some things to decide. Like how you're going to tell other people, when you're going to tell other people, when you're actually going to do it. So timelines and planning. This thing, from my experience to other people's experience, I've heard quite a variety of things. There are people I know who came in on Wednesday, said, I'm coming in Monday as me. And then they did. So that's a quite short timeline, like a few days. Other people I know have started 6 months beforehand. I was kind of in the middle. I was planning on 3 months. And that was in part because I knew that HR was going to be busy over the next 3 months because I went to them in January and there's a lot of HR crap between January and March. So that would help move past those types of things. Also because none of us really had any experience doing this, but that was probably a pretty good timeline for planning, research. And also I figured that when I first talked with her, I felt like I wasn't quite ready and I would be in 3 months. Almost immediately after I regretted and thought, I'm ready right now. I don't want to wait 3 months. So that's something that I felt is that 3 months was too long. I also think 4 days is too short. So I think somewhere in between. There's one person I know who went in 6 months early and regretted doing so. I had recommended something closer to the time that she was going to actually transition, but she went longer, and they did a reorganization in between then. So, and in which that she was getting moved to a position that was not quite as public-facing, and it wasn't really a demotion, but it was less involved than she wanted to be. So she felt it was because, she wasn't quite sure, but she felt it was because they knew that and they had time to react to it. So there is a downside to letting them know too early if you're afraid that they're going to use that in some way negatively. So considerations for the timeline planning would be things like, does your company have experience in helping people transition? Or does your manager in the organization, do you think that they would be helpful or hostile? Co-workers, customers, some people I know work essentially with 3 other people in their organization. So it's not that big of a deal because it's just a person and they have to make sure those 3 people they work with are going to be okay with it. Some people deal with a lot more people. The people who seem to have the most trouble are ones that have to interact, have a fairly public face and interact with customers or people outside of the organization. Those are the ones where managers are sometimes worried about how we interact with the outside world. The people I've heard who have been discriminated against after coming out tend to be people who are in those external-facing roles, like people in sales. The people who seem to have some of the easiest times are people who are in technical fields because they're dealing with people who are internal. It's easy to be supportive if you think it's just internal people and you can control them. If you're talking about external, some people think that people outside, because they don't have experience with it, they think people outside of the company are going to see someone think negative thoughts about us and maybe not want us in that position where we're so visible. Now, of course, that's a lot of assumptions on their point, and generally, at least in states where discrimination isn't allowed, isn't a legal thing to have. Now, discrimination, if it's not blatant, can be a bit insidious. It can be a little bit hard to pin down. If people get shifted around and you've got something that's not quite as good as it was before, is that because that was going to happen anyway? Is it luck of the draw? Or is it because you're actually being discriminated against? And it's hard to know those things, and you don't necessarily want to call them out as such if they aren't. Some of the cautions that come up, and these are things that most people have had some trouble with. Now, it turns out I didn't have any trouble with restrooms, which is good. And it seems like I'm the only one who didn't have trouble with restrooms. But I know that Diane did. Almost everyone else I know who's transitioned at work have had some problem with other people complaining about them. Some places have been very good about tamping that out. Other places not so good. Every once in a while you get really lucky, like me, and as far as you know, nobody's complained. I've also heard of other places where the company resists wanting to change the person's name in systems, and they'll give weird excuses about how it's too hard to do, or they can't do it until they've got legal documentation of a name change, which doesn't really hold water in places where people's official names aren't always used in systems. I mean, in my company, almost nobody, well, not almost nobody, but there's a lot of people who had a shortened version of their name as their name and their email address, or on business cards, or in the company directory. That they'd use a middle name, they'd use a short version of it. I mean, I did the same thing. My name wasn't my official name in anything, but they were good about saying, "Oh yeah, we can change that," and they were able to. But I have heard a few places where they just said, "No, we won't change it until it's official," and there really are. I can't imagine a case in which there really would be a technical reason not to do that. Position changes can be another one, where there's reorganizations, or they want to move you from one place to another, or reorganizations that are a bit suspicious. Those are things to watch out for. And if you think they really are, then it's something that you would want to try to call out, or at least shine some light on as far as that this looks discriminatory. When I was first looking into this, there weren't that many people I knew who had transitioned, especially within a work setting. And there was someone who I had been communicating with, and she had the advice that when you do this, it should be communicated from management. And that management should do that communication because they can help set the tone for what they expect employees and other people, how they should treat you. And by doing so, that if you do it yourself, then you're not able to show that management is serious about that. And so I took that into consideration. I thought, okay, maybe that's the right way to go. But the more I thought about it, the less it felt like the right way to go from, at least my standpoint. It felt like it was taking me out of it too much. It felt like I was letting someone else take my story and tell it for me. I thought, why should they have to do that? Why should they have to do that? Why would I want them to do that? It's like, I've got something interesting to say, and if I say it, wouldn't people respect it more that it was coming from me rather than from somebody else? So I eventually went with sending it myself, and that's actually what my management wanted too, because they had the same idea, that they didn't want this to sound like it's something coming from on high. So some of the pros I have listed here that to have management do it, they really can set the tone for that. If you think that it's going to be a hostile environment with people, that might be the way to go. And con for it, I said, it doesn't look like you're in charge of your own message. And for as far as communicating yourself, you can personalize the message if you do it yourself. You can have more explanation. If you have management do it, it wouldn't be as personal. You wouldn't be able to explain as much because you're not the one writing it. And hopefully when you're doing it yourself, if you're explaining it to yourself, it might give people more empathy for what you're saying, if it's coming from you rather than from somebody else. On the downside, it can look like that there's a lack of management support for what you're doing. And so I know in mine, what I did in order to counter that is I did say that this was being done in support of management and HR. So that way they at least have that piece within there. So for the planning part of the communication, this was my initial idea because I thought of the different groups and areas that would be affected and who should be told how. And this is part of the reason that I had a 3-month timeline for this, is because of this part. We were wondering, do we have to bring people in to explain this kind of stuff? Because that's things that you'd hear from the past. And as we moved on from that, we kept paring down. Thought, no, we don't need to have someone come in to explain this. I mean, people should be able to handle this nowadays. And we thought, well, we don't need to have this much separation here and there. So eventually it came down to this, where I sent an email to everyone. And we did a little bit of preparation here, where we brought the managers together and told them about this ahead of time, so that in case people went to them with questions about this, that they'd have a little bit of background so they'd be able to answer some of those questions. Because if we figured they didn't, we didn't know how they'd answer, because most people really don't have that much experience dealing with trans people. So if you ask a random person a question of, how do you deal with somebody who's trans, there's a good chance they would give a bad answer. So we want to give people at least enough foundation that if someone went to them with a question about, how do we deal with this person, or what do I do about this, that they would give at least a semi-informed answer. But the rest of it was me telling everyone. So I thought, we did 3 months of planning for me to send an email. That's one of the reasons I think like the 3 months is probably overkill in most cases. I just the way that we did this this manager training for it. And I helped write the presentation that we did for it. And it really was the strangest thing to know that there's 50 people in a room meeting about you. Especially because it's something like this. That there's 50 people finding out your deepest, darkest secret. And it really is awkward having this part of this happen. But I did help to write it. And we considered whether or not I would be there for it. So the 3 options for this were, I'd be there for this presentation, I'd be there for part of it, like questions or something, or I wouldn't be there at all. And as we went through it, I thought people might be more receptive to it. They might ask questions that they would feel uncomfortable asking otherwise if I weren't there. So we decided I wouldn't be there. I knew what they were saying both because I helped write this, and then also because I hijacked a room that was next to the big room that they were meeting in, from which I could listen in. I did that both because I didn't want somebody else to be in that room and then hear this stuff ahead of time, and also I just wanted to hear how it went. So it started off about me, and I know that the managers there were probably wondering, what the hell's happening? They've never had a mandatory all-manager a session with HR before. I mean, they've had big things happen. They've had reorganizations. They've had new CIOs. And they never did something like this. And then all of a sudden, my name pops up, and I'm probably thinking, what did I do to warrant having this type of meeting about this? And it was dead. And then Janet, our HR person, went through it and explained what it was. And for the first 15 minutes, it was dead silent in there. And if I didn't know, I would have thought she was talking to an empty room because it was so quiet. Nobody had any idea what to say or ask or anything. And which was actually making me fairly uncomfortable. And finally, she said something funny about, I don't remember what she said. She said something to finally break the ice, and then people laughed, and then it became like a normal meeting where people were talking, and you could hear things rustling. It was no longer like it didn't sound like a funeral anymore. So some of the things that they covered, I just picked some of the slides out of here. I took out my dead name and put my current name in here, but that's part of the reason for doing it. This is one of the sections on, this is what do I do now? March 23rd, I transitioned to work. This is March 23 of last year. Think about pronouns. You should call me by my name. It's like that. And I did say that part of what I said is because, and this was because it was convenient to do. I was one of the first one. I was the first one to do it there. That there was a unisex bathroom near where I sat, but I could use that for a couple of months, just when people are getting used to this, and then switch over to the women's one. And so that was in here. And also, but I made sure to say that because there really was only one. And it turns out that gets used all the time by guys who want to take a dump and not in the public bathroom. So this one unisex stall was being used all the fucking time. So that's why I have this here that make sure that it said in this when it's available, otherwise I'd be using the women's one. So they knew that I would be using that right away. Not all the time right away, but sometimes. We also put in there that we expect employees to act professionally, speak positively, treat me with respect. And some of this feels weird, having to tell people to treat someone with respect. Some of this feels, I don't know, we felt like we had to do it, but at the same time it also almost starts with the assumption that someone might not. So all these things, we had a little bit of hesitation with almost anything that we put in there, but we thought if we didn't, this could be one person who's going to kind of ruin it for everyone. And so that's why we put this piece in here. Now, again, this is just for the managers. This wasn't going out to all employees. And
did you start all over now that Jamie's here?
Yeah, I'll start from the beginning. You don't mind, do you?
Watch us how you compare.
It is a good time to get cookies.
Don't worry, we're going to start all over again.
Yeah, start from the top.
Start from scratch.
So now that was the communication to all the managers, and that was about a month before I did before I pulled the big switch. As it got closer, I wrote the email message I was going to go out to people. And I had to think again, this was, if you go back and look at it here, this email to everyone, I had to think of, who is this actually going to? Who am I going to tell? And I thought, well, how do you know who to tell? Because I interact with a lot of people. I've been there for 13 years. I've talked with a ton of people. And there's a ton of people in remote locations I've talked to and have never seen me. Well, who needs to know and who doesn't? It doesn't have to go to everyone, because I don't know everyone there. There's 10,000 people who work there. But it couldn't be just my little area, because I interact with so many people outside of there. So who do I tell and who don't I? So now within IT, I could go through the organizational chart and say, if I actually know the person, I should include them. If I don't really know them, then I don't really need to, because then they don't know me, and if they're looking for me afterwards, they'll probably be looking for me under my new name. What I wanted to avoid is I would rather tell more people than less, and avoid somebody not knowing, and coming to me and trying to figure out where the hell I was, and who was this new person with the same last name. And so I wanted to include more people, err on the side of sending to more people than I needed to. And I didn't go quite far enough, because that did happen a couple of times, where people wondered, they didn't realize that this had happened because I didn't include them. And I really didn't want to have to, I didn't mind explaining to them what happened. What I didn't want to happen was them to be in front of a bunch of other people and be the only one who doesn't know, and have to explain to them in front of everybody else. And have them think well, why am I the last person to hear about this? Or why wasn't I able to figure this out? Now, the times that it did happen, it wasn't in front of a bunch of other people, so it really wasn't that bad. But that's really what I wanted to avoid, and by and large, I did. But to do that, well, how do I go through 13 years of history to figure out who needs to know? So I went through into my email thing and figured out a way to export a list of everyone I'd ever emailed. And it came out to 2,500 people that I'd emailed. I thought, okay, well, that's too big of a list. I know that there's a lot of people who aren't here anymore, and there's people who I emailed one time. It's like they probably don't remember who I am. They don't need to know. So I just took that, so I did that again, and this time I put the number of times that I had emailed them. So I counted all the people who had been emailed one time. And then I went through the people who I'd emailed twice and looked for other clues about which ones, and kept cutting the list down. So finally I came out to a list of about 500 people. So that, okay, well, that seems manageable compared to what I had before, 2,500. But there's still a lot of people. And so I wrote my email, and then when I had to send it, it was one thing to write the email, another thing to know that when I hit send, within a couple of minutes, 500 people are going to know about this. And that's actually fairly intimidating. Especially when I go back and think of myself at that time. Now I'm fairly comfortable being out. At the time I wasn't quite as comfortable being out. And especially when you think of it in terms of, this is something, when growing up, I thought, no one can ever know about this. I wasn't even sure what it was, but I knew that nobody could ever know what it was. And I thought, as a kid, I thought of strategies to avoid having people find out. I thought, avoid sedation, avoid any type of future possible mind-computer interface things that would be able to read your thoughts. I mean, I had contingency plans as a little kid about how to remove myself from society in case we got to the point where people could read what you were thinking about. And to go from that to now broadcasting that to people in an email, it's quite a turnaround from one to the other. So it really was difficult to send this email. So I had it ready, and this was on a Wednesday, and it was said that on this coming Monday, I was coming in as Liz. And so I sat, and I tried to press the send button. I couldn't quite do it. Tried again. Finally, I had to turn my head in order to be able to click the button to hit send. I did, and then I got up and walked away from my desk. Some of you heard the story before, but so I finally, I could only do it by not looking at the computer when I hit send. I get up and I walk around. Like, I just can't believe I just told 500 people what had once been my biggest secret of all time. The thing that was more embarrassing than everything else put together. And then so I'm walking around, like, trying to throw myself off. And then after a minute or so of walking around, realizing, okay, I'm walking around the cubes in which all these people are reading this stuff. And it's time to go back to my cube and hide. And so I go back, and I come back to my computer, and it hasn't sent. It's sitting on the spell check. I go, spell check. No. Okay, now it's sent. So that actually helped relieve it a bit. Now, the most awkward time, well, maybe either the next couple of days were the most awkward, or the first day was the most awkward. I think actually the next 2 days were the most awkward. Having people know this about you, and just walking around, everyone knows now. And they know also that on Monday you're coming in differently than you are now. So that part was really kind of weird. Some people have done that where they send it on, say, a Thursday night and they're taking Friday off. That's actually not a bad idea, because those 2 days really were kind of awkward. If you get a chance to send it and then walk away, that's better. Now, in my case, because of the number of people who were directly affected, who might walk in surprised, because I mean, there really was quite a bit of planning about who sits close to me, who's going to be out, looking at people's vacation schedules. If someone was out the whole week, how do we make sure that they know before they come back in so they're not surprised when they come back in? And there was one person who couldn't figure out how to do that, even sending it earlier, that he was going to be out on vacation, and he was going to come in on Monday, and he came in very early, so he sat right across from me. And he would see that my nameplate had changed, things like that. And so eventually I think it was my manager who called him to let him know while he was on vacation, just so that he wouldn't be surprised and try to have to figure out what had happened when he came back in. Now, he may have read this email first, but we didn't want him to have to first try to figure out what the hell had happened before he logged in and read his email. What time is it? I'm trying to think if it makes sense to actually read the email or not. This is the email I did. I think I can read it fairly quickly, just because it's obviously, I'll post this on our website in case this whole presentation, in case anyone wants to review it later, but I think I can read this fairly quickly. So what my letter said, and I actually had a couple versions of it, but this is the one that went out to my department, so there were other versions, but the other ones were pretty similar to this one. It says that, hello friends, I'm letting you know of an upcoming change that I'd like to share with you. I'm transgender, and I've always been. For those of you who are unfamiliar with this, what it means is that my innate sense of gender differs from the sex I was assigned at birth, and the one that people generally recognize. In other words, I always knew I was female. Being transgender has been popularly described as being trapped in the wrong body, but it's an oversimplification. It's less about the outward and physical, name, clothing, body, but more so about the mental, social, societal, and emotional. Therefore, a year ago, I decided to begin transition. Honestly, it wasn't a decision as much as it was a realization that I could no longer continue pretending to represent myself as someone that I'm not, in return for short-term relief from confronting the truth. For those concerned that this is painful or tragic, or even if it's a trivial change, the process and steps I've been undertaking have been an amazing experience. One that's been more subtle and more profound than I had expected. At the same time, I remain fundamentally the same person. That doesn't mean you won't notice changes, but those changes are unambiguously positive for me, and I hope for you. The key change is I'll be coming to work as Liz Lilly on Monday, March 23rd. My email, badge, phone, IM will be updated with my new name. I'll be dressed to reflect my gender. I'll be concurrently having my name legally changed and identification updated with this real name and gender. The planning for this transition of work has been done by and supported by HR, IT management, and me. They've all been fantastic to work with, and they can be excellent resources for any of you who have questions and concerns, especially Janet Balster, Carl Sandberg, or Jack Shaw. There's only a couple things I ask of you and our coworkers. On the 23rd, please start referring to me as Liz and use female pronouns when referring to me. You need to refer to my transgender status, transgender or trans or safe. When asking questions, keep them on topics appropriate for work. And ask questions you feel comfortable about being asked and answering yourself. Thank you for taking the time to read this. Thank you even more for your support. One of the benefits for having worked for an organization for several years is the number of people you know well and the number you can call friends. I take great comfort, strength, and pride in being able to do this here with all of you. If you have any questions, please reach out to me or Janet. If you're looking for additional materials, and then I have a couple of websites listed that have good overview materials for transgender stuff. And I did, in retrospect, part of the next section is about reaction, but a lot of people did say that having it as personalized as it did, although not going into super detail, that helped them understand it better than they said they would have otherwise. That they felt that they really, that it was a better way to communicate it than this person's going to be this on this date and abide by it. So the reaction I got is that nobody saw it coming. I thought that everyone would kind of have a sense that it was coming, or at least it would be a type of thing where people would say like, well, they're surprised it happened, but not surprised it was you. Or that just kind of like if the person who's really unhealthy, the person who is very unhealthy has a heart attack, like you're surprised someone had a heart attack, but not surprised it was that person necessarily. That's kind of I thought that people were going to react to this, because I dressed like a gay pirate at work. I thought, how could people not see this coming? But people didn't. Some of the things that people said were that someone I've worked with for a long time said, I read through that, and at the bottom I thought, did that just say what I think it said? No, I couldn't have. I'm going to read it again. Read through it. Did that just say that? I'm going to read it again. So read 3 times before I thought, Jesus, this is really happening. And other people read it too, and they said, wait, is your wife going to work here? Who's this? Is this your sister? And she's going to take the same position as you? It seemed like to people the least likely thing that they would have read. Which again seemed to me so bizarre because I thought that it would click with people immediately. Because if it doesn't click with me, who the hell would it click with? So that part really was not at all what I expected. I suppose I should have known that a little bit because I didn't get anyone from my family or friends who really, maybe there was a couple people who seemed to figure out, but everyone else was kind of surprised too. So I suppose I shouldn't have been that surprised that no one at work really picked up on it either. I think maybe 2 or 3 people later said like, yeah, I wasn't that surprised. But it wasn't, but really everyone else was just absolutely, completely floored by it. A good thing, well, I don't know if that was a good thing or a bad thing, but one of the good things that did come out of it is that about 100 people responded to my email. Because about 1 out of 5 people. And all of them said very positive things. And I thought, well, is that... And I knew it wasn't just because they liked me. It wasn't like a popularity type thing. Because most of the people who responded were the people who really didn't know me that well. There are a lot of people on the list who kind of knew my name or knew what I did. But by and large, the people who responded weren't the people I was closest with. They were people who were just genuinely concerned. They were people who were just wanted to show support. Now, the other thing that probably went into that was because I was the first one to come out there. So if it had been someone else, they probably would have reacted the same way. Someone who came out after me may not get quite as much response just because this is a new thing to happen. But it was actually quite good to get that response, and I had shared it with some people. I think in group I handed out some of the responses I got, but it was actually really positive to see those things coming through, because especially those people I didn't know that well, I knew that it was something that was more societal than it was anything about me. Now the company itself, it says something about the types of people that they hired too, but still it just meant that I don't think that several years before that would have happened. So it was, for me, a very positive sign of changes within society. Another thing that I expected was that one of the things that worried me about doing this is that people wouldn't take me very seriously afterwards. I think, well, if you look at it from not our point of view, most people probably look at this as, why would somebody do something like that? Like what is going on in their minds to want to pull something like this off? And, just if you read comments on articles about us, there are a lot of people who just think, well, we're mentally ill. Or people who are misogynistic, if you think that if you have a lower expectation of women than you do of men, well, whether that's a conscious or subconscious thought, if someone voluntarily steps into that role, then there's obviously whatever you think more lowly of women than you do of men. If someone steps into that voluntarily, then it must especially be true of them. So that's the part that I thought, people may not take me as seriously as they did before. But I did find that it was, at least through now, that the opposite happened. That it seemed like it was easier for people to listen to me. That people seemed to take my opinions more seriously, which is kind of the opposite of what I expected, and the opposite of what other people have experienced too. Other people have experienced that it's more difficult for them to get their point across. It's more difficult for them to have people pay attention to them. And I have some ideas of why I may have had the opposite, but I don't know for sure. But the big day. So this was a few days after I sent the big email. Well, you saw the picture. Yes, I looked and felt very awkward. As difficult as it was to tell people that, it's another thing to now come to work dressed like a girl. It really was kind of surreal. It was really hard to get out of the car and to start walking towards the building. One experience I remember from that is that there is a big glass window next to the door, And I could see a reflection of myself walking in. And I'm like, oh crap, I'm really doing this, aren't I? At the same time, I also thought like, oh, hey, I don't look that bad. And one thing it's a general thing I've noticed about reflections in glass is that they look different than reflections in mirrors, and that sometimes you can see yourself with a different and less critical view of yourself than you do in a mirror. In a mirror, you tend to look at it and think like, oh, God, I look like a guy. But then you see yourself in a glass and I'm like, oh, hey, that doesn't look that bad. So it was kind of relieving and also frightening at the same time. And I met someone who already knew, and he had met me as me before on the parking lot, someone who I worked with. We walked in together and was walking through, and it just happened to be that nobody was around. So I was like walking through these empty hallways and finally came across somebody. And the first person I came across saw me and started laughing. I thought, you're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to laugh when you see me. But she was actually very worried about me before I did this. She thought, she was probably worried, well, she told me later, but she was worried about that people weren't going to take me seriously, people were going to laugh at me, that she was afraid that I was going to look like a mess. And she was shocked that I didn't look like a mess, even though I kind of did. You saw the picture. But it was much better than she thought I was going to be able to pull it off. And so she was actually very happy about that. That's why she was laughing. And it was such a relief to know that I wasn't presenting myself terribly. I think she thought I was going to be a wreck and have tears streaming down my face. I don't know what she thought, but she did have she was happy about that. But it was actually really easy to, after not that long, I started feeling almost normal at work. It's like within an hour, and I'd kind of forgotten that I'd even done it. Now, of course, there were a lot of little constant reminders about it, but it really was. Once I got there, it wasn't nearly as bad as the worrying about going there. It wasn't nearly as bad as the just walking in. It was actually pretty easy to get used to. Changes over time? Too soon to tell. I mean, it's been a year. Some things I have noticed to be different. Some things that people have found. I don't know anyone personally who's had this, but I've read about accounts where at first they might even be celebrated by their manager. And then after, some months, it starts to seem that they're being judged more differently. They're being judged more harshly than themselves before or than other people. And that's when you start questioning, is this because they just have a different sound than they did before because of other reasons? Do they have a different emphasis? Or is it because they're reacting to me being trans at work? And that's hard to know. This did happen to me in that I applied for a position that I had held before and actually had created and was told I wasn't qualified for it. And I created this position. How can I be qualified for it? And also that because it was a high pressure position, that I may not be able to handle that pressure, which I thought, I couldn't handle that pressure. First, I've done it before, and second, I deal with manufacturing people all the time who are very angry at me every time they talk to me. I think I can handle whatever pressure you think you're worried about. And again, is that because they're being discriminatory in a either conscious or unconscious sense? Who knows? Those things are really, really difficult to know. Another thing that's a little bit different too is that I said because it's a part of a big company, it's a big division or big department within a big company that there are people who come in and out, and there's people now there that don't know. Some of the newer people, and I found out that they didn't know by coming across that. But so you can start off with because you have to tell everyone knows. But then after some time, after the fun of telling other people wears off, then you can run into the situation where as people leave, as new people come in, not everyone is necessarily going to know. And so then sometimes you run into situations where one person does, one person doesn't. It hasn't really caused any trouble, but it is kind of strange thinking that going from being completely visible about it to not 100% visible on it. And that's all I have for this part of it as the discussion point. Questions? Not really quite. Like I had a lot of pink clothes and floral clothes and paisley. So I thought that was going to be at least some kind of tip-off, but it really wasn't.
Did you bring pictures?
Of me before? Not in the presentation. I do have a picture of I kept some of my old clothes just so I could show the difference between the old ones and the new ones and see if you can see that. But it's not as good as like your before and after pictures though.
Liz, thanks. Thanks a lot for all you've done. One of the things I can tell you is the letter that when you came out, you gave kind of not this detail, but in our other group, that you. I did write a letter, and that seemed to help a lot.